When I was a teenager, I developed curiosity for RPGs after playing the Nintendo DS version of Final Fantasy III. Yes, a little bit random, but that's where it started for me. I went back to play some RPGs from some of the systems that I owned at the time, and that included my good old Gameboy Advance slot on my Nintendo DS Lite. During a trip to the States with my parents when I was younger, I stumbled upon a retro game store, and they had a deal, some sort of get 3 Game Boy cartridges for some cheap price. My parents were nice enough to let me pick 3 games out of the bunch, and I left with 3 titles. I left with Pokemon Gold on Game Boy Color, I left with The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, and the very first Western release of a Fire Emblem game with Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade. I remember finding the characters very appealing back then, and I loved the tactical gameplay, which was totally new to me at the time. I never played anything like it. I remember getting stuck near the end of Lynn's story, and it's in 2025 that I decided to go back to this classic and fully finish it, and man am I glad I did. Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, even 20 years later, is still one of the best tactical and strategy RPGs of all time in my opinion. A masterclass in storytelling, world building, and extremely ahead of its time in terms of gameplay. This is my spoilers-free review of the very first Fire Emblem game that we got in the West. Please tell me your story with this game if you've played it before, otherwise I hope this review convinces you to at least give it a shot. The game is playable on a Game Boy Advance, or you can play it as well through Nintendo Switch Online, which is where the gameplay is coming from. So the story of Fire Emblem is very interesting. It's separated in 3 big sections. You play the first 10 chapters with Lynn, the last survivor of the Lorca tribe. Lynn's parents were killed 6 months before the events of the game, and since her father was the chief of the tribe, it created a lot of issues for this teenage girl's life. Lynn is absolutely one of my favorite Fire Emblem characters of all time. Not only is her design very dope, but she is absolutely strong-minded, and no one is going to step on her foot. The second part of the game is played through the eyes of Eliwood, a young noble from House Faray. He's on a quest of his own when he meets Lynn a whole year after the events of the first 10 chapters in the game. Eliwood decides to take a lot of responsibilities on his shoulders since he's the lord of House Faray and decides to leave in search of his father. You accompany Eliwood on his journey for a good bit, and as you progress through Eliwood's journey, that's when he finally meets Lynn, and the third and final act of the game starts. And this is where the game shines the most and where the real fun really begins, in my opinion. Seeing the 2 big teams that you built through the first half of the game come together, reach a common objective, and work together towards that objective is a pure treat. With Lynn, you are going to meet a bunch of new friends, and the same thing happens afterwards with Eliwood's section of the game. Seeing all of them come back in one big team and interact with one another and create a relationship with one another is immensely satisfying. But in a gameplay sense, it's even more interesting. You develop a bunch of strategies with your team with Lynn as a leader, you do the same thing with Eliwood, but now that both are together, there's even more possibilities, and it's awesome. All about strategy. Fire Emblem is extremely impressive with how innovative it was at the time of release, but playing it in 2025, I was reminded of just that. It's still impressive. There's a ton of features like movable and usable ballistas, for example, for archers. There's destroyable environments, like let's say you find a cracked wall in on a castle wall, you destroy it, and then you can cross that wall that you just chopped down, and you can you have a shortcut now to enter the castle. A tree is right there next to a river. Why not try and destroy it? See if it can maybe create a bridge over the river. All of these Terran elements mixed with a huge variety of characters and classes is a real treat. When it comes to the classes, you have your typical warriors, archers, healers, but you also have a lot more that isn't as common in games. You have thieves, you have axe wielders, mercenaries, shamans, dancers, and I could keep going. You also have the ability to upgrade your character's classes if you find the right item and reach a certain level with said character. The gameplay is in combat with this game. Outside of combat, you have characters talking over a fixed picture with an occasional gorgeous hand-drawn art piece for important scenes, but otherwise, the game shines in combat. Being a tactical RPG, this game plays turn by turn on a grid. All classes have different movements possibilities and different ways to attack with different types of weapons. Speaking of weapons, there's a huge variety of weapons in this game. Most classes can use a variety of different weapons, and each type of weapons has a level. As you level up a weapon class for a character, he gets the possibility to wear even more of weapons in that class and maybe even reach the ability to use new weapons at some point. It's very addictive to try and gain as much experience as possible with each battle. That's part of the fun in combat. One of the staples of the Fire Emblem franchise is the weapon triangle. The weapon triangle is a very simple concept at first, but it's very fun to always have in the back of your mind to avoid making a critical mistake. The weapon triangle is simple. Swords beat axes. Axes, they beat lances. And lances, they beat swords. Again, very simple at first, but it must not be underestimated. The weapon triangle for Fire Emblem is as important as to exploit weaknesses in Persona or Shin Megami Tensei games, if you're familiar with those IPs. One of the many features in combat is breakable weapons, and I know that this is not something that everyone enjoys, but it's certainly very appealing to me here in Fire Emblem. The idea of having to experience with a lot of different types of weapons and weapon classes because of them being breakable is very fun to me. It's addictive. They also decided to put staffs in the game, and if you find the right ones, some of them will allow you to repair some of your other weapons that are about to break. Again, all about strategy. If you have played a Fire Emblem game before, you know that death is serious in these games. In this one, you only have one option, and it's to take battles seriously. If one of your party member or one of your unit dies, it's the end for them. You're not going to see them again. That's it. It really adds to the experience in my opinion, and definitely makes a difference with how much I enjoy a Fire Emblem game. Modern titles give the player the option to turn this feature off, but I highly recommend keeping it as it was intended for maximum strategy and fun. Battles are very fast paced. It made for a very fun time as a pick up and play type of game for me. When I reached the halfway point of the game, battles became a little longer, so it was really perfect in terms of length. What I did is I played one battle at a time to progress in the game. The story is simple enough to make sense playing it that way. In terms of gameplay, this game can stand proudly next to modern Fire Emblem games like Three Houses or Engage in my opinion. But it's when you look at the gameplay outside of combat that if that's what you're looking for, I have to be honest, it's very lacking. There's not much to do. Three Houses is definitely the superior game with what it has to offer in that sense. You have relationship with other characters, you have tons of side quests, side activities, all of that. But in my opinion, where Fire Emblem is the most fun is in combat, so it is a high recommendation for me regardless with the Blazing Blade here. I'll even go as far as to say that all this side content in Three Houses wasn't really the best, and it kind of took me out of what I consider real turn-based strategy fun here with Fire Emblem, and again, that's what I'm looking for in these games. The combat was fire in Three Houses, don't get me wrong, but outside of combat, I thought it was a little too long for my taste. The game is very impressive and extremely ahead of its time in terms of everything that you can do in combat. The Blazing Blade has a lot to offer in terms of hardcore turn-based strategy. There's even, characteristics to where you are on the grid. If you are in a forest, you're not going to be able to navigate as easily as if you are on a plane, random plane. If you're in the mountains, you better not be on a horse because that's not going to work, bro. But if you have a unit that can fly, well then, great. It's really expertly crafted. They thought of every little thing. When it comes to visuals and presentations, Fire Emblem shines. Most 16-bit games age really well, and that's certainly the case here. Looking back at it in the 2020s, the character portraits are absolutely fire. The important hand-drawn images that replaces the fixed background of regular scenes that are put in there for important moments in the story are extremely impressive. The presentation in combat is great as well. It's easy to find characters on field and to recognize who's who. My favorite thing to come out of this entire game has to be the character animations. So much love was put in the combat animations, it's crazy. Every single character has their own little animations and movements in battle. They're so smooth. The mage's animations are sick. So are the critical hits, which are completely different from a regular hit for each character. I love it. It's simply pleasing to look at, and it's just a pleasing game in general. Speaking of being pleasing, one of the things that the game nails out of the park is the music. Of course, being a GBA game, the audio quality is leaving a lot to be desired, but the actual compositions here are amazing. As always with any Fire Emblem game really, the music is fitting for what's going on screen, and it's extremely memorable. Blazing Blade, not different here. The soundtrack is a real bop, and I can definitely see myself going back to it in the future or use some of the music as background noise for some of my videos. Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade was to me a cool strategy RPG from my childhood that I remember playing a lot but never really completing. Going back to it almost 20 years later after having completed all modern Fire Emblem games, I must say that this game holds up extremely well. It is certainly one of the best FE game of all time in my opinion and is definitely worth your time. The game is playable through Nintendo Switch Online, but it's definitely still amazing on original hardware. I played this whole playthrough on Analog Pocket, and I replayed a lot of it to record gameplay here in Full HD for you guys, and it was just an amazing experience from start to finish. My actual playthrough took me around 30 hours to complete, with just a little bit of side quests completed, and again, there's not much in terms of other side content, so that was it for me. Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade is a heavy recommendations for me. I hope you guys give it a shot. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this review, a quick thumbs up really helps, and I have more retro reviews coming in the near future, so please stay tuned for that. Bye.